Hi, everyone, and welcome to this next webinar. This is a collaboration between the UIA Animal Law Working Group and the DePaul University Center for Animal Law. I'm going to be kicking off the event. I'm Jamie McLaughlin. I'm the VP of the Animal Law Commission Working Group for the UIA. And I would like to introduce someone who I'm happy to say has had a major influence on my career in animal law, and that is Professor Margit Livingston at DePaul. And she runs the DePaul Center for Animal Law, and also Brett Davinger is there. And I would just like to say thanks to Brett for all of his help with this. So Maggie is going to be helping with the program today. She's going to be introducing our wonderful speakers, and she's also going to be helping with the roundtable and facilitating the questions for that segment of our program today. If you are an Illinois attorney and you'd like CLE for this program, we will be providing information. Brett Davinger will be in charge of that, and he will help you with your 1.5 hours of CLE for this program. So without further ado, Professor Livingston teaches and writes in the areas of intellectual property, commercial law, and animal law. Her articles have appeared in the primary law reviews of North Carolina, Iowa, Fordham, William and Mary, Washington, Nebraska, and Boston College, among others. She's won numerous awards for her teaching, scholarship, and service, including the DePaul University Spirit of Inquiry Award in 2014, the DePaul College of Law Faculty Achievement Award in 2018, the DePaul University Excellence in Teaching Award in 2022, and the DePaul College of Law Excellence in Teaching Award in 2023. She is a graduate of the renowned Second City Conservatory for Improvisational Comedy, and recently studied advanced acting at HB Studio in New York. She holds a JD and an MA in theater arts from the University of Minnesota and an LLM from the University of Illinois. Thank you for being here, Professor Livingston.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm so excited about the program and our wonderful lineup of speakers. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Camille Labchuk, who is an animal rights lawyer and executive director of Animal Justice, which is Canada's only animal law advocacy organization. Under her leadership, Animal Justice fights legal cases in courtrooms across the country, works to pass groundbreaking new laws and policies, and ensures industries are held accountable for illegal animal cruelty. She has litigated to advance animals' legal interests at all levels of court, including before the Supreme Court of Canada. She is a graduate of the University of Toronto Faculty of Law and Mount Allison University, and she lives in Toronto with her cat, Cecily. Welcome, Camille.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Appreciate that. Just bear with me for a moment, everyone, while I think I need the host to enable participant screen sharing. I wonder if Jamie or Maggie or someone can just enable participant.
Hey, sorry, I was just going at webinar settings. It should be automatic.
I have a pop-up that says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, goodness. How's that? Are you able to now?
Yes, back in business. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so just 1 second here. Okay, great. Hopefully everyone can see those. So thank you so much for the introduction. I'm looking forward to speaking with you today about the legal landscape for farmed animals in Canada. The title gives it away a little bit. Like most places, the foxes are quite literally in the hen house, and we see quite a lot of industry involvement in shaping standards and action for farmed animals. Just to set the scene a little bit, this is a chart of the number of land animals who are slaughtered in Canada every year since we started tracking in 2015. It's a large number. That number, was in the mid 740 millions when we started tracking almost 10 years ago, and it's gone up significantly. And I can tell you that most of the animals who are killed are chickens. And most of the growth in the consumption of animals as well has been chickens, and not necessarily because people are eating more meat in Canada, but because the population has increased and we are eating more chicken meat, not necessarily meat from animals like pigs or cows. So you might think that with that number of animals used, there would be some regulation over animal farming, and there is. There is a fair degree of statute that deals with things like food safety and quality. The Milk Act, for instance, has all kinds of really intricate, detailed requirements about the dairy industry and how milk should be produced in a way that ends up being safe and nutritious for Canadians. We have federal legislation as well, the Safe Food for Canadians Act. I don't want to make the case that there's no regulation over farming, but when we look at animal welfare regulations on farms, it's a different story. That slide is left intentionally blank because there simply aren't any laws in Canada. There are no provisions that deal with standard practices, with regulatory standards for how animals should be treated on farms. There's nothing like any restrictions on the types of cages or devices that can be used on animals, the types of anesthesia they should be given before being subject to painful procedures or anything like that. It really is a blank slate. What we do have, just to set the scene for you a little bit, is federal criminal laws and then provincial animal welfare laws. We're a federally organized country with both national laws and provincial/state level. So under the criminal code, which applies across the country to all animals, it's an offense to cause unnecessary pain, suffering, or injury. Now, the word unnecessary has generally been interpreted by police and by prosecutors to mean that if there is a necessary purpose behind the treatment of animals, i.e. for food, for experiments, for some industrial purpose, that, more or less the practices within that area will not really be subject to criminal law scrutiny. So it's very, very rare that we see the criminal federal law enforced respecting farmed animals. The only time you would really see it is in the case of like an apocalypse case, like some farmer just stops feeding animals on a hobby farm and they're all lying out in the field dying and someone sees that, and the farmer could be prosecuted in that case for neglect, but it's rare for other contexts. For provincial laws, there are laws that generally apply to animals such that they shouldn't be caused distress. However, there are exemptions in basically every province for what we call reasonable and generally accepted practices of agricultural animal care, management, or husbandry. So essentially, the province is saying that you can't cause distress to an animal, but if you're doing so in a farming context, it's okay if you're adhering to generally accepted practices. Now, what are reasonable practices and what are generally accepted practices? Generally accepted by whom is one of the questions. Reasonable to whom is one of the questions we ask. Is that reasonable and accepted by the public? Is it reasonable and accepted by government or by farmers involved in the industry themselves? It's a bit of an open question. There's not a lot of case law on this topic, but I would say most actors tend to look to something called the National Farm Animal Care Council, which produces codes of practice, and they consider those codes of practice to be the generally accepted standards under the law. So let's talk about NFAC for a minute, because it's a structure for governing farmed animal welfare that's a little bit unique. It's not identical in other countries, although there are some Commonwealth equivalents and similarities in places like the UK and New Zealand. But I would say Canada's system is probably worse. So NFAC, the National Farm Animal Care Council, is a voluntary organization. It's mostly run by industry. So its members include largely companies. So there could be retailers, there could be grocers, there's certainly livestock transport associations, there's farm commodity groups like the pork farmers or the beef farmers or the chicken farmers. But nearly all of NFAC's members who participate in making these codes that we'll talk about are themselves deeply invested in animal agriculture and profit from that business. So what NFAC does, it doesn't have legal powers, it doesn't create laws, but it creates these voluntary codes of practice that industries, if they like, can follow. And many of the industries do, or at least they say they do. The codes of practice are supposed to represent the national understanding of animal care requirements in Canada. To be a member of NFAC, animal justice actually wouldn't be eligible because members must accept the use of animals in agriculture and not be opposed to practices. There are only 2 animal protection organizations who are involved in NFAC. That's World Animal Protection and a group called Humane Canada. These codes are developed by a committee, reviews science, and then comes up with recommendations and is then approved. I will say NFAC considers all the science, but rejects much of it if it's not economically convenient for farmers to abolish a practice that might cause pain to animals. And its codes include so-called requirements, which is a bit of a misnomer since they're not required in any substantive way under the law, and then recommendations as well. NFAC is essentially a self-regulatory vehicle for the farming industry so that it can make up some of its own rules and standards and essentially prevent the government from stepping in to do so. It's been very effective at keeping the government away from regulating farming. And you can see here the number of different species that it's produced these codes for. It's virtually all areas where animals are farmed, including on fur farms. This graphic is actually a little bit out of date now. I don't think they produced a new one, but they continue to revise and update codes. So since we're talking about law today, let's talk a little bit about the legal effect of the codes. They are referenced in several provincial laws that sometimes is explicit. There are a couple provinces where it seems like you probably have to follow the codes if you're involved in farming. Others, they're referenced less explicitly, and there's just sort of this reference I shared earlier to generally accepted practices. So you can kind of assume that means NFAC, but they don't say NFAC codes. The codes are typically incorporated when they are referenced in laws as a defense rather than a standard that should be followed. So the law would go like this. It would say you can't cause distress unless you do so in accordance with generally accepted practices. So that means to actually convict a farmer of distress, you would have to show A, that there is distress, and B, that they didn't follow the NFAC codes. If there was distress, but they followed the NFAC codes, no good. So essentially it's a get out of jail free card rather than a standard that must be followed. And the codes are not enforceable very easily by authorities since they are not clear legal standards. And what the industries have done, in addition to creating these codes and standards themselves, they've also started introducing internal industry verification programs to follow up on farmers and check and see if they're following codes. And so this is an effort to minimize the role of enforcement agencies like government agencies in favor of internal industry metrics. Of course, the problem here is that the government and the public have no idea what's happening with these internal industry verification processes. Unlike traditional law enforcement, there's no right to information, there's no public sharing of information about which farms are following the codes, which are not, how an industry is doing overall. So it really is a process designed to both set standards and set a quote unquote enforcement model that insulates the industry from outside criticism. So just to give you an idea of what's in some of the codes and why I view them as insufficient, I'm just going to point you towards the code for laying hens. I think it's well known that battery cages, as seen in this image, are some of the worst, most cruel practices that you can do to animals on farms, and they're being abolished in many, many places. In 2017, in response to pressure from Canadians, NFAC released a new layer code of practice that said it would phase out battery cages for hens. But instead of promoting entirely cage-free systems, it suggested that enriched cages, in addition to non-cage housing, would be acceptable. And it put a 20-year timeline on the phase-out. So I don't think anyone who is concerned about hen welfare believes that's sufficient. 20-year time frame, and then of course keeping enriched cages. So what's tended to happen in Canada is that the industry, instead of going cage-free, is transitioning away from these worst battery cages, but into enriched cages, which often don't look much better. So you can see an enriched cage here. These are images recently obtained in Canada from inside enriched cages. Very, very difficult to tell the difference between those conditions and those of a battery cage. And just for greater clarity, I'll put a couple of them side by side here. So it's a challenge. Moving on to the pig code, that's another issue. The pig code in 2014 said that it would phase out gestation crates for mother pigs as of July 1st, 2024. So that deadline is coming up, and there's some exceptions there, but let's assume this is a reasonable step forward. Unfortunately, the pig industry announced that it would no longer meet this deadline, and instead it wanted to push it to 2029. So not acceptable. They're doing this for economic reasons, of course. It's not economically expedient for them to phase out gestation crates, even though they are quite cruel by that deadline. So I think it's clear from these two examples that the codes are not sufficient to ensure any sort of timely advancements in animal protection in Canada. I'm going to speak just briefly about transport and slaughter, and then we will go on to a current issue in Canada, which is ag laws. Animal transport laws in Canada are widely considered to be inefficient. They were updated a few years ago. I'll just show you just a quick chart of what the regulations previously looked like and what they look like now. I would say the biggest difference is that they reduced the maximum time that many species could be transported in, down from often 48 hours to about 36 hours. And this is transport without food, water, or rest. That's what the acronym FWR stands for. But these numbers were typically chosen on the basis of economic convenience rather than science. This is a document we received through an access to information request where the government was considering the science around spent hens. So those hens that we just saw in battered cages, obviously suffering greatly at the end of their lives, are transported to slaughter. They're called spent hens. It used to be 36 hours. The government wanted to do 24 hours, but 8 hours is when the science said detrimental effects for these animals were observed. And unfortunately, we see the government didn't follow the science in this case, or really any of the other cases. The scientific case is the last column, and what was proposed and generally accepted is the middle column. We got a further piece of information that while the 12-hour time limit is supported by science, the maximum time was increased as a result of industry feedback. So we really see the long arm of the industry interfering with these codes in a way that's economically convenient, but not protective of animal welfare. There's one bright light when it comes to animal transport in Canada, and that's this issue of shipping live horses to Japan for slaughter. This is an odious practice that Canada is engaged in. It's only been going on for about 20 years. And the horses are raised in feedlots, they're purpose-bred, they are flown to Japan on airplanes that can cause them significant distress. Sometimes they die or collapse in flight. And luckily, there is a move underway, or underfoot, I should say, to ban this practice. So there's a bill in Parliament that's moving forward. In fact, will be debated next week again in a committee that we've been working on extensively, that hopefully will ban this practice. Just a brief note about slaughter. This is generally what our slaughter laws say, that animals must be stunned before being bled through a mechanical blow, electric current, or gas. This does include exceptions for religious or ritual slaughter. Mammals can't be suspended before they're unconscious, but birds can be shackled by their legs. Unlike some other jurisdictions, birds aren't exempt from slaughter requirements, so at least that is good. Now, I'm going to turn to talk about an issue that has been a big deal in Canada recently, and I think it's important for people to understand this context, especially to guard against this in other countries. And that is the issue of ag-gag laws. So ag-gag laws, of course, many will know, were originally introduced in the United States. And they're a suite of laws designed to conceal cruelty on farms by making it more difficult for advocates to obtain information by increasing the penal or criminal consequences on them if they do. Sometimes this could be an absolute ban on photography or videography on farm property. Sometimes it could be a restriction on someone getting a job undercover, and there could be other mechanisms in there as well. So at one point, Ontario's livestock industry said it didn't like ag-gag laws. This was an article from 2013, back when they were being passed left and right and center in the United States. And the industry up here said that it wasn't a fan because it prioritized transparency. Well, things then changed. What's changed specifically was that undercover exposés into factory farms became more of a factor in Canada. Activists, including groups I was involved with, started working undercover on farms and exposed horrible cruelty in chicken farming, pig farming, veal farming, slaughterhouses, you name it. Every industry was investigated. Many of these exposés featured prominently on the nightly news. And for the first time, I stopped hearing Canadians say, oh, those videos of cruelty, that's only in America. We previously, as Canadians, one of our national pastimes is feeling morally superior to Americans. So it was really easy for Canadians to adopt this narrative that that wasn't us, when in fact it was. The other thing is that these exposés resulted in legal consequences for the first time against farms. They were pleading guilty to cruelty based on the actions of their workers and management in ignoring the abuse. But there are two more factors that led to egg gag laws in Canada that were different than in the US. And the first is the rise of the animal save movement in Canada, which is where it started. Toronto Pig Save originated here in my home city. And it involves people bearing witness outside slaughterhouses and oftentimes giving water to suffering animals who are on their way to slaughter. And this is a photo of Animal Save founder Anita Krines, who many of you probably have heard of. She was prosecuted for giving water to pigs and acquitted after a lengthy criminal trial, which embarrassed the pig industry significantly. That was one factor. Second factor is that there were a number of farm occupation/sit-ins where people got word that a farm was abusing animals. There were poor conditions, unlawful conditions. And in this case, in BC, activists staged a sit-in where they went onto the farm with biosecurity gear and invited the media on to see for themselves. The reason, of course, that people are doing this comes back to what we spoke about earlier, which is that we don't have any laws regulating the treatment of animals on farms in Canada, and there's no oversight either. And so you can only imagine why people might feel like they have to take matters into their own hands. So we currently have egg gag laws in a number of provinces. Alberta, AB on the map, was the first to pass egg gag laws. They have an absolute ban on using any misrepresentation to work on the farm. Ontario was next, my home province, and it's close to an absolute ban, although it applies mostly just to farms and not any other property. Alberta applies to everything. And Manitoba passed a less serious version that pertained mostly to animals in transport. Ontario included animal transport. PEI has a law in the books, and there's a federal bill being proposed right now. Animal justice was inspired by many actions in the US, which have successfully challenged egg gag laws in court and seen them struck down as unconstitutional. And so we pursued that same approach in Ontario. We challenged Ontario's egg gag law, and I'm happy to share that just last week we were successful. We got a judgment in the case rejecting Ontario's egg gag law as unconstitutional, specifically the aspects of it that made it illegal for animal advocates to go undercover on factory farms and slaughterhouses to expose cruelty. We did challenge a component as well that restricted people from touching or interacting with animals inside slaughter trucks to give them water or to perhaps take photos when there could be incidental contact. And unfortunately, that provision was not struck down, but there may be an appeal in that case. We're anticipating that the government will now appeal. So what's the basis for this ruling? It's the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which for the Americans is like our Bill of Rights. It guarantees people's freedom of expression under Section 2B, which is really the important part here. So the judge in the case said that the ban on undercover investigations was unconstitutional because it interferes with the protected right of free expression. So the government was seeking to regulate the kind of speech you could engage in with an employer if you're an undercover person seeking a job, and sought to prevent you from filming and exposing animal cruelty to the public. The judge found this was not justifiable under a provision of the charter where the government could justify something if it's important enough. The judge said that publicizing the way animals are treated is an issue of importance to at least some members of the public because people are entitled to be informed and decide whether they find conditions on farms acceptable, and that's all that investigations sought to do. He rejected a lot of arguments from the government that there was a biosecurity risk, a food safety risk, a farmer safety risk from any of these investigations. So it was a very solid decision on that front. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, we lost on the provision about interacting with animals inside slaughter trucks. Currently, we don't have word yet on whether the government will appeal, but I anticipate they will, and we'll be seeking to block the federal egg gag law that's proposed, repeal egg gag laws in other provinces, and of course, challenge them where they remain on the books. So I will wrap things up there. I think that's just about my 20 minutes, and look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille. That was very enlightening. We're going to save questions till the end, so we're going to move on to our second speaker, Antón Aguilar, who is Executive Director of Humane Society International, Mexico. He obtained his master's degree in comparative politics from the Institute of Political Studies in Paris and a bachelor in international relations from the College of Mexico. His current responsibilities include the design and implementation of various animal welfare programs, including working with lab animals, farm animals, and pets. Welcome, Antón.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm gonna switch to another device and you're gonna stop seeing me, but you will be able to hear me so I can run the slides. So give me a sec. All right, then. Okay, so hello, I'm Antón Aguilar, Executive Director for Humane Society International Mexico, and I'm going to talk to you about farm animal regulations in Mexico. Here's what I want to cover. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about HSI and HSI Mexico. I want to give you a snapshot of the farm animal landscape in Mexico, legislation, challenges, unprotected animals, and corporate commitments. So Humane Society International is one of the largest animal protection organizations in the world. We work to protect farm animals, companion animals, lab animals, and wildlife. And we opened our Mexico office nearly 10 years ago. We've had some significant victories in Mexico, including a federal dogfighting ban and a federal cosmetics animal testing ban. Also, in terms of corporate policies, over 100 companies have committed to cage-free and crate-free housing systems. Mexico is a large global farm animal producer. It's really among the top 10 across the board in terms of the various farm animal products, including eggs, beef, pork meat, bird meat, honey, etc. If you're interested in hard data about farm animal production in Mexico, I encourage you to visit the information system of the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development that has some nice infographics and hard data on this issue. I don't know if you can see the website, otherwise I can send it to the organizers and distribute. It's in Spanish though, so you would need to understand Spanish. In terms of legislation, the most important bill is the Federal Animal Health Bill. It is federal in scope, and it is competence of the Ministry of Agriculture. It is mainly a bill that focuses on animal health rather than animal welfare. Its goal is to prevent and control animal disease, promote good practices in breeding, traceability, and slaughter, regulate veterinary activities, pharmaceutical, chemical, and food products for animal intake, and it also deals with foreign trade. It regulates imports and exports of farm animal products. It's a pretty long bill, but these are some of the main highlights. We also have what we call Mexican official norms, which are secondary regulations issued by the executive branch. We have a humane transportation Mexican official norm that was issued by the Ministry of Agriculture and was first drafted in 1995. Its goal is to avoid and reduce suffering and stress during transportation, avoiding transportation without prior access to food and water, transportation of pregnant animals with risk of giving birth while being transported, screaming, hitting, and otherwise abusing animals during transportation. It mandates the separation of animals according to species, sex, weight, etc. during transportation, upholding and downloading at adequate height, and adapting vehicles properly for animal transportation. We have some massive farm animal markets where uploading and downloading is significantly challenging. The animals often get injured in the process, and the National Mexico University runs a program there where they hire workers with mobile ramps to help reduce injuries in the uploading and downloading of animals. Another important Mexican official norm is the slaughter methods Mexican official norm, which was also issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1995. It was amended in 2014 and is currently under review. HSI Mexico was invited to provide input for that review. Its goal is to minimize pain, suffering, anxiety, and stress. No animals should be poisoned, paralyzed, asphyxiated, drowned, or hit to death, according to this norm. Any method of slaughter or euthanasia must be carried out by trained personnel and under the supervision of a veterinarian. Animals must be kept calm, avoiding shouts or noises that upset them, and they should not be moved by hitting, pulling, or poking. And stunning and killing methods have to be done for each species specifically. The norm includes farm animals and wild animals, and it's very graphic and specific in terms of the stunning and slaughtering methods for each species. Now, I also want to share with you that the current president of Mexico sent a constitutional amendment proposal to Congress earlier this year, which plans to enshrine in the Constitution the need to have humane education in study plans, also to ban animal abuse, and to recognize Congress has competence to legislate on the protection of animals. I can read through the text just because this is something very recent and interesting. So Article 3 of the Constitution deals with education as a human right in Mexico, and the text that would be added reads, study plans and programs shall incorporate the protection of animals according to their nature, characteristics, and the bonds they have with people, and the prevention and prohibition of the mistreatment of animals bred and used for human consumption, among others. Article 4 would include this text: the mistreatment of animals is prohibited. The Mexican state should guarantee the protection, proper treatment, conservation, and care of animals pursuant to the provisions of applicable laws. And Article 73, which is about what specific issues Congress can legislate on, would read, Congress has competence to legislate on the protection of animals according to their nature, characteristics, and the bonds they have with people, the prevention and prohibition of the mistreatment of animals bred and used for human consumption, and necessary measures to control plagues and address health threats. We have presidential elections this summer, and this is widely seen as an electoral move, which is an indicator of how animal protection is becoming increasingly important for the broader public in Mexico. Some of the challenges we see when we visit farms is our lack of enforcement and implementations. We see painful practices without anesthesia or analgesia, like tail docking, castration, clipping of teeth or horns, among others, the use of cages in birds, chickens, quails, sows, rabbits. And we really need to improve housing systems. We have no cage or crate-free regulation, although the Ministry of Agriculture did start drafting an official Mexican norm on cage-free eggs, but this drafting exercise stopped and was suspended indefinitely. We also see as a challenge the use of inappropriate management practices, such as bending the animals' tails or hitting them to make them move, dragging or suspending them with ropes or chains to move them, among others. So we generally see poor transportation, and slaughter practices. Another significant challenge is we have unprotected animals. We have no federal ban on bullfights or cockfights. 5 states in Mexico out of 31 have banned bullfights in recent years. This is an increasingly unpopular sport. 80% of Mexico City's inhabitants consider bullfighting a cruel spectacle, according to recent polling. And last year, a judge suspended bullfighting shows in Plaza Mexico, which is the world's largest bullfighting ring, but the decision was recently reversed as litigation continues. One of the bases for this ruling is Mexico City Constitution, includes animal protection as one of its articles, and it acknowledges animals as sentient beings. Cock bands have been banned in the state of Veracruz, and this also came up to the Supreme Court, and the ban was held as constitutional. The farmers were arguing that the decision affected their economic rights as producers, but the court ruled in favor of the ban. I also want to share with you what we as HSI Mexico focus on in terms of farm animal protection, and where we really focus on our corporate commitments. We don't do that much work on legislation or regulations, although, as I said, we've been invited in the review process of a Mexican official norm. So we've been working with large companies in Mexico. Many of them are international companies that have a huge market in Mexico. Some of these are Mexico-based global companies who are committing to transitioning to cage-free eggs or crate-free pork meat in their supply chains. We have already over 100 of these companies making these commitments, and this, of course, makes a massive impact in the lives of animals. A good example of progress is Grupo Bimbo. Bimbo is one of the largest bakery companies globally. It is a Mexican company, but a global company as well. And they have committed and are doing good progress in the implementation of their commitment to transition to 100% cage-free eggs by 2025. This is really a trend that is also showing how consumers in Mexico care about these issues and are pushing companies to move in the right direction. Let me switch to my other device. I think I'm going to have a little bit of trouble turning the camera back on, but this is it for me, and I'm turning up my camera later just to say goodbye or for the quick Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antón, for that informative presentation. Our next speaker is Iga Glazewska, who is an animal lawyer with a master's degree in law from the University of Warsaw, specializing in the legal status of non-human animals. She also holds an animal law LLM degree from the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. She advocates for animal rights through interdisciplinary approaches, and as the director for Poland at Humane Society International Europe, she spearheads various programs aimed at implementing anti-cruelty laws, improving farmed animal welfare, fostering human-wildlife coexistence, and combating fur farming and trophy hunting. Welcome, Iga.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen now. I'll try. Let's see. Can you see it now? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, it works. Okay. I need to, sorry, I'm not very good at this. Or is it? Either way. Okay, let's try that. So I will try to outline how the law protects farmed animals in Poland, but to do so, we need to start with the European Union law. And we will be circling back to it throughout the whole presentation because it is the EU regulations provisions that shape the legal landscape of member states when it comes to animal law. So firstly, real quick, what is the European Union? It is an economical, political union partnership of 27 countries in Europe, and we call those countries member states, and Poland is one of those member states. So it's described as, EU is being described as having the most progressive animal welfare provisions, and often cited as a model to be followed by other regions, which in my opinion might speak more to how dire the situation is for farmed animals globally than how well it is protected. They are protected in the EU. Nevertheless, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which is one of the two treaties that form the constitutional basis of the EU, stipulates that animal welfare shall be taken into account when formulating policies. And we see a clear recognition that animals are sentient beings. And we can say that animal welfare has been recognized as an important value deserving of protection. So we have several types of legal acts in the EU. I will try to not to overcomplicate things, so I will only focus on two most important for our topic and in general. So we have directives, which set a certain goals, objectives that member states must achieve, but it's up to those countries what laws they will introduce to reach those goals. And countries must incorporate the directive into their national laws in a process we call transposition. In the case of regulations, these are binding legislative acts that are directly applicable in all member states. So the EU sets certain minimum standards, but individual countries can exceed them and have more stringent laws regarding the farmed animal welfare. And we see that the EU landscape in this regard is quite diverse. So we have, for example, Germany, Austria, Luxembourg, Czechia that have prohibited the use of enriched cages, so-called enriched cages for laying hens. Sweden, for example, has banned the use of stalls and farrowing crates in pig farming. Austria has banned barren cages for meat rabbits, and so on. So it also should be noted that the scale of animal in production, so-called production, varies in individual countries and member states. So altogether, it is estimated that EU has over 2 billion land farm animals and over 1 billion farmed fish. In Poland, we estimate that there is around approximately 200 million land farmed animals kept, but majority being poultry. So here we have an overview of legislation, EU legislation concerning farm animals, including regulations on transport and slaughter, and directives concerning the protection of animals kept for farming purposes, the so-called general one. And we have species-specific directives that are regulating the breeding of pigs, chickens raised for meat, so-called broiler chickens, calves, and laying hens. We do not have detailed directives concerning other species. So for those species, the basis is the general directive, which is rather limited and does not address the specific needs unique to each species, such as cows, rabbit, and so on. So we also need to remember that most of these laws apply to farms of a certain size or transportation above a certain scale. So, for example, the directive regarding laying hens do not apply to farms with fewer than 250 hens. And farms with fewer than 6 calves are exempt from the ban on keeping calves in individual boxes. And provisions on transport also do not apply to the transport of animals for non-commercial purposes, and so on. So these are just examples of those exemptions. So we might wonder, why are those animals treated differently? All are equally sentient, capable of feeling pain, suffering, have their own interests and needs. Oh. So these are the two most important legal acts, the most important legal acts regulating animal farming in Poland, although the two last, you can see, have rather technical character. And as mentioned already, the majority of those provisions are either transpositions or direct application of EU laws. So in general, Poland does not exceed the minimum standards set by the EU, except for the ban on force-feeding ducks and geese for foie gras. And for several years, we had a ban on slaughter without stunning, but since 2014, sadly, it's been allowed again. So in the main piece of animal protection legislation, the Animal Protection Act, which regulates offenses against animals. Animals, meaning vertebrates, although there is an ongoing discussion whether only vertebrates, are recognized as non-things capable of experiencing suffering and requiring humane treatment, respect, protection, care. And humane treatment is understood as treating an animal in a way that considers its needs and provides care and protection. An Animal Protection Act also categorizes animals in a way that reflects the functions attributed to animals by us and roles in which they are placed and the ways they're being used. So these categories include domestic, farm, stray, wild animals, and so on. And depending on where an animal is placed, whether it's considered a companion animal, a farm animal, wild animal, the degree of protection will vary. And for instance, the law includes a prohibition on killing animals, following by a list of exemptions to this ban. And one of them is slaughtering and killing farm animals. And when it comes to the definition of a farm animal, the Animal Protection Act refers to yet another law. And we have here a list of what is considered to be a farm animal, and it is a closed list, but it doesn't include all animals we in practice raise and slaughter for food purposes, like pigeons, for example. It also completely omits fish for some reason. So a pig or a rabbit would have completely different status and therefore different scope of protection, depending whether it's an animal kept for farming purposes or a companion animal sleeping on a couch. So a pig on a farm could be legally slaughtered, whereas killing a pig, which is a companion animal, would be a crime. And we had an interesting ruling from the Provincial Administrative Court, which ruled that a pig, like any vertebrate animal, can, when in a relationship with a human as a friend and a companion, can obtain the status of a companion animal. So the Animal Protection Act lists 2 offenses against animals: killing animals, with certain exceptions, so as already mentioned, and animal cruelty, and both can be aggravated offenses. And cruelty is understood as inflicting or knowingly allowing the infliction of pain or suffering. The Act lists examples of cruelty, but it's not an exhaustive list. Among the examples listed are keeping animals in inappropriate living conditions, employing cruel methods, and breeding, and so on. But farm animals are, at least in theory, protected from cruelty, just like any other animal. However, the research indicates that over 80% of all victims of offenses under the Animal Protection Act are domestic animals, while only slightly over 10% are farm animals. And there are many reasons that we can explain it with. I don't think it is because the farm animals are so well protected. It's rather there is a different societal awareness of their suffering, and response to their suffering is different. And we also do not encounter farm animals as often. They are hidden behind the walls of farms. And also, not to mention the systemic harm and suffering, which is absolutely legalized. And we will examine this in a moment when we will zoom in on certain species of animals most commonly farmed in Poland. So let's take a look at how the law relates to the protection and welfare of pigs. Firstly, we can distinguish two main types of pigs farmed, so breeding sows and so-called fattening pigs, which are usually slaughtered at the age of 6 months, so really, really early. We have we have requirements regarding stocking density, how much space is allowed, guidelines for access to food and water, air quality, and so on. A very important provision to note is the ban on routine tail docking and reduction of corner teeth. Unfortunately, in Poland and other EU member states as well, this provision is not properly enforced. In fact, these procedures are routinely carried out instead of, as it should be, farmers ensuring that animals have access to appropriate enrichment beforehand. And pigs are very intelligent, very social, very curious. So when they cannot satisfy the natural needs, express their behavior, they have nothing to play with, nothing to dig, they become bored, and they may become aggressive. So this may result in tail biting, which brings us to another requirement related, which is enrichment. So they must have permanent access to sufficient quantity material and to enable proper investigation, manipulation activities. But in practice, we encounter problems with enforcing the law. Very rarely it is actually that they have access to all this investigation, manipulation activities, sadly. On the positive note side, all feathering of pigs is prohibited. They are kept in groups, which is very important for their welfare, as they are very social. They should also be fed with bulky, high fiber food to avoid constant hunger and to keep the stomachs filled. When it comes to cages and crates, as we see, it is quite different to the previous image of a happy pig. It is allowed to use farrowing crates. This is what we can see on the first picture. And the use of gestation crates have been limited to the first 4 weeks of pregnancy. So in Poland, as well as across the entire European Union, we have 4 farming systems in which laying hens are being kept. So cage systems are being used still, not barren cages, as Camille already mentioned, but enriched cages, which is not a massive difference. They are, though, equipped with certain enrichments, including nests, litter for pecking and scratching, and perches. And this is intended to allow hens to have to express the natural behaviors, basically. And eggs from each system are labeled in a specific way to facilitate consumers in making informed decisions, also when it comes to welfare of hens. Unfortunately, we do not have any specific regulations governing the farming of pullets. So young hens, very young hens, before they reach the age at which they can lay eggs. So they are not subject to any particular guidelines. So as you can see here in the picture, enriched cages, as you already see, you already saw this in Camille's presentation, but it doesn't look very idyllic as well. And this is standard enriched cages farming system. And significant problem remains with chick culling which is a maceration of male chicks, who are unnecessary byproduct of the egg industry. And it is estimated that in Poland alone, 37 million of them are killed every year. So, and as I mentioned, with those 4 systems that we have in the European Union, and while some member states do not use cages, enriched cages anymore, and are going beyond EU requirements, in Poland, the vast majority of eggs come from such farming, and we estimate that 39 million laying hens are still living in cages. In case of chickens raised for meat, so-called broilers, and it is important to note that the scale is enormous. Poland is one of the largest producers of poultry meat in the EU, and sadly the requirements are not very strict or detailed. Chickens are usually slaughtered when they have like 5-6 weeks, so still babies. There are no requirement to provide them with any sort of enrichment. There is no limit on use of those fast-growing breeds, which are very detrimental to the welfare of the chickens. They gain immense weight in a very short time, and the legs, the joints cannot withstand this overload, and most of them are unable to stand by the end of their short lives. The regulation regarding stocking density are also difficult to consider progressive. Let's try imagine 15-17 chickens per square meter, which is, I think, a little over 10 square feet. So the reality for most chicken farms is that the chickens never see the sun, never touch grass, don't have access to fresh air. We didn't have time to delve into the issues of transport and slaughter. Perhaps we will touch on those during our discussion later on. But I think what is most distressing is the lives of farmed animals, the whole short, horrible life filled with suffering and pain. So I hope you have some sort of you are now able to imagine it a bit and have somewhat better understanding of how it looks in Poland and the EU. So that's that from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iga, for that impactful presentation. I'd like to invite all of our speakers to come back online on video so we can have a bit of a discussion. So I'd like to pose a question to all of you. What do you think is the most, in your individual countries, what is the most urgent challenge that you are facing? Antón, what do you think about Mexico?
Well, I think the most urgent challenge in our case is implementation, really, implementation and enforcement. We have some there is room for improvement in our current regulatory framework, but it exists, and it is there, and it is quite adequate. But it's enforcement that really is lacking in all of the sort of activities, including breeding, transportation, slaughtering, housing. It's just most of the standards are there, not all of them, but several are, and it's just we have poor enforcement and implementation. This is unfortunately a problem that goes beyond animal protection legislation in general. The levels of impunity and lack of enforcement in Mexico are significantly high. We work, for example, in terms of companion animals and animal cruelty towards companion animals. We work with local police in various states to train and try to help enhance enforcement capabilities. So that's an area of work, but it is still a very pressing challenge and something that we need to improve.
Camille?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would say going even a step further back from enforcement, I view one of the most significant challenges in Canada is that we just don't have any laws on the books. And so that makes it impossible to enforce any actual standards. And, for us, what this comes back to is the massive disparity in power between the public, which of course wants strong standards for animals on farms. You rarely see that much public agreement on the fact that animal cruelty is wrong, and people who are still consuming animal products don't want animals to suffer. Yet the massive farming industries are some of the richest companies in the world, and farmers are, very well organized lobby. I'm sure this is the case in Mexico. I certainly know it's the case in the EU. They are the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, and politicians are generally willing to bend over to do whatever the farm industry wants. So we have this real challenge in bridging the gap between what the public wants, what the industry wants, and what laws are actually on the books. And, for us, getting legal standards in place is really high on the list.
Iga?
I would say all of the things we already mentioned by Camille and Antón. Law enforcement remains a significant problem in Poland, and we have veterinary inspection that is designated to enforce animal protection laws, but it's very understaffed, underfinanced, and animal welfare is not their priority. Public health is, and often the veterinarians, inspectors that are supposed to monitor and check if everything is okay on farms collaborate with those farmers and producers, and this just doesn't work. And there's also this disparity between where we are when it comes to animal public awareness and how people perceive animal welfare, how important it is, and decision makers and farmers lobbying and pushing for basically protesting any sort of improvements in this area. So yeah.
Thank you, Iga. Antón, I wanted to ask you specifically about bullfighting and cockfighting in Mexico. There seems to be public sentiment against it, and yet the laws have not kept up with that, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's what Camille was talking about, powerful lobbying. This is really an instance where you can see that the sentiment of the public is overwhelmingly against having this kind of cruel fiestas. These are different industries. Bullfighting is more of an elite spectacle, and kind of an elite that identifies with Spanish heritage, and some of these people are like very powerful entrepreneurs, businessmen that are sort of have various investments, good relationships with government, and also are sort of investors in this bullfighting industry. So there is an entrenched interest of a part of the elite that wants to keep this going on. It's also a generational thing. It's older people normally that attend to these shows, and it's also something that we feel is fading away. That just the demand is not there. So for instance, the bullfighting ring that I was talking to you about, which is the largest bullfighting ring in the world, activities were suspended there. Bullfighting activities were suspending there for several months, and it's used as a concert arena, or even if it became, a mall or provided another kind of entertainment, it would really be much more profitable. So it doesn't really make sense economically because the demand is not there. But it's just an old thing that is taking some time to go away. But we believe it's going to be gone, if not because of legislation or judicial rulings, just because of the loss of the market at some point in the near future. Cockfighting is a different industry. It's more like like a popular, it's not an elitist sport, it's more like a ranch, ranch popular spectacle. And some, that is not from what we see. I mean, we don't have hard data on that, but we know anecdotically that it is not necessarily becoming less popular. And that is sometimes, and this is a hypothesis, but some places, particularly some rural places, have no access, like no or very limited access to entertainment or culture, or like they are remote, no theaters, no cinemas, no alternatives. We worked in a small municipality in Yucatan where they had a cruel fiesta that was not cockfighting or bullfighting. It was a different kind, in which they filled piñatas with animals and beat them to death. And this was something that had been going on for several decades. And we were able, because it was a very small place, it was also a place where we could intervene and persuade the mayor there and the priest and the people that this was unacceptable, that this had to change. And we offered them, and we continued to, this was maybe some 8 years ago, that they stopped doing that. And we offered alternative entertainment options for them. So in Yucatan, they like baseball, or they like some specific kind of comedy shows. So we bring that along there kind of in exchange for them not to continue having this kind of cruel fiestas. And it has been very successful. It has also become a more inclusive space. So when they were beating piñatas with animals, it was a very sort of macho, bloody activity. Now they're like, they have these cultural activities, and it's like women and children join in. So I think that's a good example of how these cruel fiestas can transform if you provide humane activities, entertainment activities that do not involve cruelty to animals.
Right, alternatives for people.
Yes.
Camille, I wanted to ask you about ag-gag laws, and what are the arguments made by those who support those kinds of laws? What is the justification for them?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Maggie. So the justification is never that it's about concealing animal cruelty. That would be a very unpopular way to bill that to the public. The proponents of ag-gag laws usually say a number of related things. The first is about protecting private property from trespass. They claim that people are trespassing, and if you get a job on a farm working undercover, that's really a trespass because the permission that you received to be there is negated by the fact that maybe you didn't disclose that you belong to an animal protection organization. So trespass is a big one. The second one is biosecurity. So this idea that we must protect farms from pathogens and from the risk of diseases coming onto farms that could affect animals. That's a really big one that they continue to use. The way some of the ag-gag laws in Canada have gone down is they've used mass trespass events as justification for them. And, you can accept that in the case of somebody coming onto a farm, there could be some risk that they could bring a pathogen. Now, I think it's an easy public narrative. It's not really borne out when you look at the facts that these events are risky in any way. Animal Justice has analyzed decades worth of federal data about reportable disease outbreaks in Canada, and nearly all of them come from poor farm practices, from farmers not adhering to their own biosecurity protocols. That could be including things like letting wild animals in contact with barns of birds. That could be driving forklifts between a barn that's infected with a pathogen and one that's not. That could be using needles on different animals and passing pathogens along. So when you look at the actual data, trespassers and people who come onto farms are not usually the highest risk. So that's a little bit suspicious. But of course, they use those trespass events as justification for passing something even more draconian that has nothing to do with trespass in the first place, like this ban on undercover investigations. So those tend to be the justifications that I hear the most often. One that came up more recently in Ontario as well is this idea that farmers feel afraid on their property. And they try to equate, industrial animal farming with people simply having small family farms where there might be a house on the property, which is not often the case, especially in the larger industrial farm context. But the farmers in the case really tried to blur the lines between those two types of models, where maybe there is a small family farm and there's a house nearby, but people go into a barn or there's an investigation at the barn, and try to use sympathy for farmers for support. So, interestingly, in the Ontario case, the judge rejected all of these justifications, really wholeheartely. He shot them all down. He said that they do not apply, that the evidence the government put forward was not compelling. They showed no evidence of biosecurity risk, no evidence of food safety. And in fact, that people who are animal activists who seek jobs on farms have an incentive not to harm any animal. That's not why they're there. It's for the opposite reason. And same goes with people coming onto farms unwanted. He found that there was no link between that and undercover investigation. So it was a really nice rejection of those arguments that we so often see.
Do you find any connection between footage obtained by undercover investigators and the public's attitude towards farm animals? I mean, is the public influenced by this type of footage?
I think absolutely they are, and that's exactly why it's important for groups to go undercover to obtain that footage. So much of farming, almost all of farming, is secret. It's behind closed doors. The only farmed animals that the public typically sees are dairy cows in a field if they go to the country. No one ever sees pigs in a field, you never see chickens in a field, and that's because these animals are almost always kept inside large industrial barn operations that are on private property that the public doesn't have access to. So people still have this impression, and I'm sure this is the case in Mexico and EU as well, that old McDonald's family farm is still the predominant farming model. And of course, nothing could be farther from the truth. Almost all farming now is highly industrialized, highly mechanized. It's a production line level of efficiency where the well-being of the animals is not the priority, and they live no semblance of their natural lives. And of course, the industries, whether you look at egg cartons, which still have pastoral grassy imagery on packages of eggs, even though those hens have lived barren, boring, horrible lives inside cages indoors without seeing sunlight, you can understand why people are fooled and why they have this misperception. It's because the industry really invests a lot of its significant resources back into this idea that Old McDonald's farm does exist. So I think it's so important that we are able to gather this footage, get it on the nightly news, get investigative information out there to the public through journalism, so that people have an accurate perception of what goes on and they're no longer fooled by the industry.
Right. Iga, how would you assess Poland in its animal welfare laws as compared to other EU countries? Is it a leader? Is it lagging behind? Or where does it fit in?
We are not a leader, that's for sure. And it's hard to estimate. We do not exceed the minimum standards in general. As I mentioned already, there is a ban on foie gras, not trade of foie gras, but force feeding ducks and geese for the production of foie gras, basically. But other than that, we do not exceed both the minimum standards that the EU sets, and there are still issues with law enforcement and enforcing those standards, so which is pretty depressing. And we have like in Germany much more progressive policies when it comes to laying hens, for example, and the majority of the hens is out of the cages, and in Poland is quite the opposite. So I don't, there's a long way to go for sure for us, and that currently the farmers are protesting all over the EU, including Poland. And the thing they are protesting against is also improvements when it comes to animal welfare. So it's not the best time for animals, but we are doing our best.
I'm sure you are.
A question too. Oh, sorry, Maggie, I didn't mean to interrupt. I actually wanted to follow up on everyone's presentation today, because it seems like one thing that has been pointed out, the common denominator here, is that these industrial practices that we use in the United States for farming has been exported globally, and it's continuing to be exported. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, have you seen any mass depopulation events when it comes to things like avian flu? Here in the United States, we've had a light shined on ventilation shutdown. Our Honor, which is a group that's focused on veterinarians speaking up for farmed animals and other things, has focused on that. And during COVID, it was largely hidden at first that ventilation shut down and other types of mass depopulation was happening to pigs and chickens. And so with the avian flu, like Camille had mentioned, a lot of pathogens are coming from, for example, wild animals, wild ducks that come in contact with chickens and things like that. So I'm wondering if you know, in any of your countries, if you have seen any type of export of this new US industrial farming practice of ventilation shutdown or other types of mass depopulation of farmed animals that are deemed infected, or they need to get rid of them for other reasons.
I'm happy to weigh in on that. Of course, Canada follows very closely what the United States is doing, and we tend to engage in similar practices. So far, we have not seen evidence of ventilation shutdown in Canada. That doesn't mean it's not happening, but simply that at this point, we're unaware of it. Animal Justice embarked on a project in relation to avian flu mass depopulation events, trying to figure out through government records what different techniques were being used. And none of them are very pleasant, but none of them seem to be mass depopulation. I'm just looking at my notes to try to recall, but you know, I'd say most flocks were killed with carbon dioxide gas and gas chambers. Another third or so were killed using cervical dislocation, so essentially breaking their necks. There's a variety of tools that are used to do this, including one called the Verdizo. There's, you know, plier-like tools that they use to do this that are quite troubling to see. There are also captive bolt pistols being used for larger birds like turkeys. So those tend to be what's used. But there has been there has been a bit of a shortage of CO2 gas in Canada. And so as a consequence, our federal agencies have looked into foam-based methods for killing birds, which I think gets into and gets into more of those concerns as well. And so we have uncovered some evidence of foam-based killing going very poorly, and that's certainly troubling.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that.
I have a question for all of our speakers, and that's, do any of your countries have provision for ballot initiatives that could override the influence of the agricultural lobby?
Oh, I wish. This is I think about this all the time and how envious I am of all the US states for this as a possibility, and cities. No, in short, Canada does not have that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen any legislative movement here at all. I know that was the main driver of regulatory action in the States, and I'm very envious.
Mm-hmm. Antón or Iga? Ballot initiative in your country?
Yeah, I'm not up to date. There has been some changes in terms of how what we call a popular consultation can be introduced, and this is a very recent development. So, but I'd have to document myself on that. I wouldn't want to give you wrong information, but I can check it up and get back to you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
It's not a thing in our legal system, but there is a possibility of legislative initiative when you have 100,000 signatures, citizens, that can initiate a proceeding, but not a ballot per se, I think. Yeah.
So that is not something that has been used widely in any of your countries. It sounds like it's not really available. Yeah. Another question I have is there a way to raise and slaughter and transport animals humanely? I mean, is this chasing something that doesn't exist, that there is no real humane way to house animals, transport them, and then slaughter them. No matter how we change things, it's always going to be cruel in some way or another. Camille, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say you could imagine a perfect world in which there is a way to, care for one animal in a way that doesn't cause pain, transport them in a way that doesn't cause suffering, and kill them in a way that they don't even realize it's happening. You could imagine that theoretically. In practice, absolutely not. We're talking about millions, billions of animals who must be raised, transported, and then slaughtered. And even if you could theoretically come up with this perfect way to do it, the concept that anyone would be able to translate that into ideal practices in the real world, where we've got poor weather conditions, we've got lack of economic resources, we've got improperly maintained machinery at slaughterhouses and fast line speeds. I think the prospect of that actually happening in the real world is zero.
Okay. Antón, Iga, any thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Iga.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think on such a scale that we deal with right now, and when it's driven by financial interests and animals are commodities, it's hard to even imagine that we need to be this perfect world Camille described, and we need to be motivated by respect to animals and guided by science, and yeah, it's hard to imagine indeed.
Do you foresee a time when people will eat lab-grown meat and meat that does not come from live animals? And the need for farm animals will diminish greatly?
So I would sort of like to jump in with a little bit of idealism and optimism. And I know it's very challenging, and it's probably in Mexico, yeah, maybe one of the most challenging places, just because it's a developing country, but it's also a major global producer. So the volume is very big and the conditions are very poor and enforcement is poor. But there is always, I think, room for improvement, and gradual improvement does happen. So I don't think we should sort of give up hope in face of in the face of daunting challenges. And we do see progress, like I was telling you, in this tiny town in the Yucatan, and it's not the whole country and it's not the whole state of the Yucatan, but it is one step in the right direction. Or the better, like, cage-free, crate-free systems in Mexico. These were practically non-existent, say some 5-10 years ago. It is becoming a trend by the push of major companies that are demanding this, and the market is shifting. Still, it is a very small percentage of the total of the production, but it is going in that direction, and you have to start somewhere, and not give up hope. It's not realistic that people will stop eating animals from one day to the other. So we can continue trying to improve the conditions of animal breeding, housing, transportation, slaughter, gradually, and until one day they might not be necessary, but it's something that needs to be addressed now.
So we're making progress, but the ultimate goal is maybe in the future somewhere. Another question I have is there something governments can do to subsidize farmers who want to develop humane practices? I mean, these are economically taxing on farmers. They're not as efficient. And can the government provide incentives to farmers who want to move towards humane practices? Camille, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would really like to see that. Governments are extremely willing to subsidize farmers for improvements in production efficiency for new slaughter plants, for new supply chain management issues. It's one area where they're extremely willing to spend money. And so it feels to me like less of a heavy lift to get them to spend money on farmers in a bit of a different way, in a way that also benefits animals. So I always think that's an important part of something that should be built into the ask as animal protection advocates when we are seeking stronger practices and to abolish some of the most cruel ones that exist right now. Asking for government support to facilitate that and make that happen, I think is important.
Iga, any comments?
Yeah, there is this wide range of programs actually that people are within the EU can be subsidized for certain animal welfare measures and increasing standards. So yeah, it's there, but doesn't seem to gain a lot of attention from farmers, and that is yet another issue that we don't have perhaps time to delve into. But yeah, there are this, of course, there are subsidies for those huge industrial farms, but there are also opportunities for those small scale farmers that would like to improve the lives of the animals they keep. So yeah, luckily in the EU, there is an availability of those subsidies, but yeah, practice is yet another topic.
Do you all have any questions for one another?
Can I jump in and just say, with regards to your last question, it is hard to imagine government subsidizing, say, better housing systems, but it is not the only way to get there. Consumers, we are seeing consumers increasingly attentive to how farmers, raise their animals, or how the cosmetic industries, if they're using animals or not, if the products are cruelty free or not. So this is a trend in the for consumers in Mexico and globally, and this is something that companies and eventually farmers will have to ponder. That there is a growing demand that will push for competition, and citizens as well. Like, citizens are like, animal protection is becoming more of a political topic. We see that, and people care about that more. We had our first presidential debate last Sunday, and animal protection was mentioned. It was not the main topic. It was not, it was mentioned a little bit in passing, but it's there and it's gaining track, and we had never heard of that before in a presidential debate. So it's an indication of how voters and consumers preferences are shifting, and political and economic elites are incorporating those concerns, I believe, more and more.
I think that's so exciting. I can't believe that it was actually animal welfare came up in a presidential debate. I can't even imagine. I did have a question for Iga, and that question is, when it comes to the laws in Poland, what would be the most important change or new law or shift in the legal regime in Poland that would benefit farmed animal welfare?
Yeah, thank you for that. There's so many things I would like to see happening. But I think what would be realistic, and with political will, it shouldn't be that difficult. It's establishing an institution of animal rights, animal protection ombudsman. So someone who'd be able to as a state body, advisory voice that would speak for animals and would holistically monitor the protection from the point of view of animals and their interests themselves, not public health, not consumers, but for animals, and speaking for them. So I think that would be a great a great improvement. But yeah, it remains to be seen if we will be successful in trying to
I
do
think
that.
that's actually a really amazing idea, and a unique idea too, but also very timely. And well, we're at time actually, so I'm going to just wrap up the program. Great job, everybody. This has been such an informative panel, and it's so important because not everybody out there that practices animal law is aware of what's going on in different countries. So this series is trying to highlight that. And so anyone out there, if there's a country you'd like us to cover with this UIA program, please let us know. Thanks, Maggie, for moderating our panel today. And I want to say special thanks to Brett Davinger. He's the Associate Director of the DePaul University College of Law Center for Animal Law. He's going to be editing this recording, and we're going to be posting it on the UIA's Animal Law Commission Working Group YouTube channel. So it'll be available for playback and as a resource for everybody. Thanks to the attendees for joining us for this. And if you need the CLE, you need to contact Brett Davinger for that. His email is bdavinge, that's BDAVINGE @DePaul.edu. Thanks to my esteemed panel today. Thank you so much. You guys did an amazing job, and we are so grateful for your work to put this together with us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.